Okay, there we go.
Got it.
Good deal. Cool. Let's get started then. Today's lecture is about water management strategies, and there's a heavy focus on water supply and demand management in this presentation. But I want to talk about kind of historical sort of water supply strategies and where we're going as a community on better managing that water. So. Um, Let's start off by talking about reservoirs and well fields. So traditionally, if a community needed more water, they would either build a reservoir or sink a new well, right? Those are the two sort of conventional approaches. And in the past, there was always, it seemed, an abundance of groundwater and plenty of surface water, at least one of those two things. But I wanted to talk a little bit about reservoir construction as it stands right now. um, Texas as a state hasn't built a reservoir in decades, at least not a big water supply reservoir. And now there's two under construction at the same time. Um, Oklahoma hasn't built a reservoir in a long, long time either. It's just they're expensive, they take a long time, and it's just not an easy way to get new water supplies. Most of those ideal sites for reservoirs are gone, or when I say gone, there's a Walmart in the footprint of the reservoir, or there's some really important environmental concerns or something like that. So it's super hard to get a permit for a reservoir, and going through that whole process of permitting and funding and design just takes a long time. So this is Lower Bodark Reservoir, um, pretty close to Oklahoma. It's a tributary of the Red River. This one is actually filling up right now. When I first moved to Texas in '99, it was already being planned. The reservoir itself, the dam, and all the construction of the features are going to cost about $1.6 billion. So it's a huge amount of money. And it's going to bring ultimately water to the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Okay.
The and let's see, I thought I had another slide. I do have another slide. So this is kind of showing the timeline of that project from, they talk about 2003, they began in earnest and filling up the reservoir in 2023, so a good 20 years. So you've got to be dedicated to these days if you want to build a reservoir. It's not a case of firing up the bulldozer and putting up a berm when it appeals. So on the groundwater side of things, there's a map. This is a really, really good resource for anyone who's interested in water data. The Oklahoma Water Resources Board has these interactive maps, and you can click on the left-hand side of this tool and show where, for example, whether monitoring stations are, or groundwater wells or wetlands and things like that. Hey, Brandon, would you mind muting yourself?
Yes.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, I do apologize. I thought I did.
Yeah. Yeah, no worries. So you can see, and you can zoom in. It's an interactive map, so really anything related to water in general, you can find on this interactive tool that you can see right now. I think the point of this particular slide is to show you there's a whole lot of wells across Oklahoma, and some of those wells are super productive, and some of them aren't. But the point is, there's groundwater just about everywhere in the state. And you can use this interactive tool to show where lakes are, for example, water supply reservoirs and things like that as well. So when you look, and I'm reverting back to the Texas Water Plan here because that's what I know best, but if you look at the amount of water to be generated through reservoirs and wells, it's actually a fairly small amount of the total. 305,000 acre feet per year in groundwater, and about 220,000 acre feet per year in reservoirs. Those numbers get out bigger when you look out a full 50 years, but what you can see is that there's a whole bunch of other strategies that are going to be needed, frankly, to meet the future water supply needs in Texas, but also in Oklahoma. It's no longer just new wells and new reservoirs. So I'm going to talk about the ones that have red stars next to them right now. So if you look at these strategies by type, reservoirs are only, this again, this is Texas, but reservoirs are only about 13% of the total. Conservation are the ones that are shown in pink, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We sometimes call that demand management as well. That's our kind of our ability to reduce the need for water versus increasing supply. And when you're looking at water supply needs, you're looking at both sides of the equation, right? You want to develop supplies and you want to reduce demand. And I think, like I was saying, conservation, I don't know what that total adds up to. It's a little bit less than 30%, and that's true for most states. About 30% of the new water management strategies in the future are going to be made up through actually demand reduction rather than supply enhancement. So let's talk about water use by sector. So irrigation is a major user in both Oklahoma and Texas. In fact, it's more dominant in Oklahoma than in Texas. And it's almost 50% of the water supply, amount of water being used in that state. Municipal is the next biggest one, and that's something like 35% of the total usage. And let's talk about irrigation first. So irrigation, the most common type of irrigation are these center pivot irrigation types. So you'll see these if you fly over the Oklahoma Panhandle or the Texas Panhandle, these ginormous things that have a well in the middle or some sort of water supply in the middle. And then they'll reach out sometimes over half a mile and irrigate a crop in a circle around that center pivot point. And they look at the center, they look a little bit like what you've seen in that center slide there. And at the periphery, they look more like what you see in the top right-hand corner. In the Panhandle area, in the high plains, the source of water is predominantly the Ogallala. And like I said, that's the most common type of irrigation. So if you look at a aerial photograph, go into Google Earth or something like that, you can see these areas where there's just a huge number of these circles, these crop circles, irrigation circles. And on the left-hand side, you can see essentially the Ogallala. And what you're seeing here are declines in water levels, and that's because of overuse. Interestingly, with the Ogallala, most of the recharge occurs in the Nebraska area. And by the time that water gets to Oklahoma and Texas, it's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years old. So it takes a long time for the aquifer to recharge. There is a little bit of recharge of the aquifer down in these southern portions, but it's pretty small. So the conservation opportunity here is interesting. You can move, so the old irrigation methods was these spray irrigation systems where that water was just sprayed into the air and it fell to the ground like rainfall. But you can retrofit these devices and actually buy new ones the same way that have a more of a low pressure system where these hoses come out of the top and actually deliver the water with much less spray, delivering that water much closer to the ground, much closer to where that water is needed in the root zone. So that results in some pretty good conservation measures being implemented. So you need only about 80% of the water that you need if you're spraying. So that's a pretty good way to conserve water. Most of that water, especially on a dry, hot day, most of that water or a good amount of that water evaporates before it gets to where it's needed. Another interesting development over the last few years has been on the technology side of things and kind of carefully monitoring soil moisture, modeling crop needs, better management of the water on site, and also installing these evapotranspiration networks. So you get a really good feel for exactly how much water is needed by the crop and making sure that you don't overwater. And these are some of those tools. Farmers walking around with these little digital devices on their meters and using weather stations and evaporation networks. So that's a pretty effective way. The other thing, of course, that's been occurring with irrigation technology or developments in the agricultural industry is on crop genetics. So in addition to better irrigation technology and better monitoring and modeling of water crop management, there's also pretty good genetics that are coming about such that our yields, even though we're using slightly less water than we used in the past, the yield for things like corn and cotton have been going up dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. So it's kind of an interesting thing to see. So another type of irrigation is called flood irrigation, and this is a fairly common practice still in the Rio Grande Valley, good for fruit and vegetables and sorghum, where canals are delivering that water into these areas with pumps, and the pumps pump that water into pipes, and then the pipes just flood these fields down these narrow furrows. And that's a way of bringing water to these crops, but it's obviously not a very efficient way to do that. So what folks have been doing is lining these canals with concrete. So instead of just having an earth canal, you can line it with concrete, and then you're not losing all that water to the underlying soils and aquifer. And another thing, of course, you may have seen this in places in Oklahoma and elsewhere, certainly across the Middle East, it is super widespread. But this drip or trickle irrigation, where you've got this soft, flexible PVC tube with these irrigation emitters delivering water, really delivering water to where it's needed. So while we're on the topic real quick, one of the things that's going on in some parts of the country is that water is more valuable to some sectors than others. So in the Rio Grande Valley, there are conversions of agricultural water use to municipal. So a farmer who has a water right, for example, could sell their water to some sort of municipality or industrial use and get a lot more money out of it than they were getting for agricultural production. In the Rio Grande Valley, there's kind of a unique situation where the river is over appropriated. So there's more permits than there's water available. And to deal with that situation, the regulators have implemented this 50% rule. So if you're converting an agricultural water right to a municipal water right, it's automatically cut in half volumetrically. So the farmer still gets a good amount of money, and it's still lucrative for the farmer and still worth it to the city, but that water right is cut in half to try to get back to a situation where there's enough water for everyone. So basically on conservation in conserving water in agriculture, there's lots of different methods to do that, like I've discussed. And if you look at efficiency of water use in the ag sector, it's gone from 60% or so. In other words, 60% of that water actually gets to the root zone and is used by the plant. In the past, to something like 88 to even as much as 99 or 95% today, which is pretty impressive efficiency. In the municipal water sector, there's lots of opportunities for conservation as well, and that's what we'll talk here. So in the southern states, places like Texas and Oklahoma, about 30 to 50% of that water is used for watering lawns and gardens, and approximately 15% of homes have pools where there's lots of water loss due to evaporation as well. And our capital or per capita water consumption, which means every person in the states, are using about 150 gallons per day. So if you've got a household of 3, that household is typically using 450 gallons per day, which is a huge amount of water, of course. Higher than the rest of the US, but not too much higher. Water loss rates in the distribution system are super high. In this slide, I say it's between 5 and 15%. That's for the more sophisticated municipalities that have spent a lot of time and effort reducing leakage. In some of the smaller communities that I've visited, both in Oklahoma and Texas, those leakage rates can be as high as 50%. So there's a huge opportunity to save water in those distribution systems. So conservation, like I said, could be thought of as reduced demand or reducing demand. So if you reduce or put restrictions on when folks can water their lawn, that can have a big impact. A lot of people with their irrigation system, they'll water the lawn every day, and that's way way more water typically than the lawn needs, even in the middle of the summer. Um, Lawns or sprinkler systems can also have leaks, and that can use a lot of water if not repaired. And in any one of those things that you see listed in there, plumbing codes are basically where regions are required to sell water efficient washing machines and shower heads and things like that. Um, efficiencies in commercial car washes, efficiencies in laundry facilities, water at restaurants. That one kind of makes me laugh a little bit, where they don't automatically bring you a cup of water at a restaurant, but interestingly, it turns out that can have quite a big savings, because it's not only the water that you drink, the water that they deliver, the water that you potentially don't drink, but you rarely leave the restaurant with a cup full of water, or sort of your cup empty. Typically, they're filling that cup up, but there's also the water needed to clean those cups and whatnot. So actually, we did notice in some cities where they didn't automatically bring you a cup of water when you sat down, that actually had some water efficiencies. And there's some other ones there, of course. I'm not going to go through all of these, but aggressive leak detection and repair. There's all kinds of technologies out there. Some really cool that you might look into, involved in detecting where those leaks occur, because you don't always see those leaks at the surface, and then repairing those leaks. So that's a really good opportunity for municipalities to reduce the amount of water that they're using without placing regulations on the folks that they're delivering to, which is always appealing, especially in this part of the world. Drought contingency plans are also interesting, where a bunch of folks get together and try to decide what they're going to do to plan for that next drought. The fact that we'll have a next drought is a given. It's not a what if. It's we are going to have a next drought, and so what do we need to do to be better prepared for the next drought? And that often results in better and more efficient use of water. Let me talk to you really quickly about a success story, a big success story. So City of San Antonio, most of you probably have been there at some point, in Central Texas. The population of San Antonio has gone up by 67% since the 1980s, but the total demand on that city has essentially remained unchanged. So the way they've done that is by reducing demand from 170 gallons per person per day down to 90 gallons per person today. And they've done this through this sort of this three-legged stool, this three-pronged approach, if you like. Education, where they talk to folks about, or encourage folks to reduce their water use, and educate them on where that water comes from and why it's important to conserve. Outreach to industry and various water users, and then reasonable regulation. So, like most cities, they really don't want to regulate people. They don't want to tell them they can't do things. But at the same time, sometimes there's some egregious situations that they just have to regulate in order to get a better handle, or get a better water use regime in place. And I like this kind of quote from City of San Antonio. Our business model, and of course the city's in the business of selling water, right? So they don't really have a great incentive to, it's like someone selling cars and trying to tell people that they need less cars. The city gets revenue out of selling water, so a conservation program is not necessarily a logical thing for them. But for them, their business model is to convince their customers to buy less of their product. And they've realized that makes sense. And it makes sense because if they had to go develop a whole new supply, which interestingly they've done recently, that's a major endeavor. And the city has continued growing, and they've kind of maxed out on their ability to conserve water. So they've actually built this ginormous project. I think the price tag's at $2 billion now. to bring groundwater from northeast of Austin down to the San Antonio area. So it's a huge well field and a huge pipeline. But to bring that water in is incredibly expensive, and they're going to have to put that cost on their customers, which nobody really wanted, but that's where they're at. Oklahoma has taken a really interesting approach to conservation. A few years ago, I think it was 2012, they produced this piece of legislation, or this goal, I should say, Water for 2060. And their goal is to consume no more water in the year 2060 than they're consuming in 2010. So they gave themselves 50 years to get there. And water use has been increasing since 2010, but their goal is still 2060. So they may well be able to get to a point where their water use in 2060 is the same as 2010. But they're going to do this and have taken a similar approach to San Antonio, right, through education and free water audits and guides and implementation of best management practices, but also providing sort of incentives, loans for folks to construct these water conservation measures, grants and things like that. And the goal is, while they're doing all this conservation, to try to preserve economic growth, right? Not to reduce folks' ability to grow their companies and grow their businesses by forcing them to use less water. So let's talk real quick about ASR. And ASR stands for Aquifer Storage and Recovery. And it's a really neat water management strategy whereby when there's a periodic excess of water from a particular source, and it's more conventionally surface water, but sometimes groundwater in another aquifer, they capture that water, and I'm going to read you the quote down here. The storage of water in a suitable aquifer through a well during times when water is available, and recovery of the water when from the same well during times when the water is needed. So essentially what you're doing is grabbing excess water when it's available and injecting it underground to store it in some sort of formation, rock formation, an aquifer. And then when it's really dry and your other sources of water are running low, you can pump that water back out of the aquifer and then use it then. And the idea is that, if you've got this periodic excess of water, you might as well do something with it. And storing it underground is potentially more efficient than storing it above ground in a lake, because you don't have to deal with evaporation. And these underground aquifers, if that aquifer is confined, and you can see that in the schematic on the screen, if you've got a confining layer above and below in particular, you can store this water in sort of like a bubble underground. It stays there pretty much stationary, and then pull it back out of the ground when you need it. There's actually not super common, but there's 21 states in the US that have ASR projects and 15 countries of the world that do it as well. There's actually a slight variation of this being contemplated really near East Central University in the Arbuckle-Simpson Aquifer, where we're looking for these karst recharge features, these caves or these holes in the ground, and diverting streams or rivers into those karst features to recharge the aquifer that way. So there's some interesting research going on about that. Typically, if you are injecting the water back underground, then that water needs to be treated in order to meet drinking water standards before you do that, so that you don't contaminate the aquifer. This is the Edwards Aquifer, which is a karst. And when I say karst, it's sort of a cracked, but what I mean by that is a cracked limestone aquifer that has these fissures in it. The water can typically move really quickly there. It's very similar to the Arbuckle-Simpson Aquifer. So that aquifer that San Antonio has relied on for decades, exclusively for decades. Now they've got other sources, but that aquifer is very similar to the Arbuckle-Simpson Aquifer that underlies a good portion of south central Oklahoma. So this is a schematic of the ASR system that San Antonio has. So they're periodically, they have excess water in the Edwards Aquifer. And what they're doing is transporting that water to a different aquifer, the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, injecting that water into the aquifer. And when they need it periodically, and you can see this area in green here on this slide, periodically when they need it, they're pulling that water back out of the aquifer. And this has been a super successful project for them, much, much cheaper than building a reservoir, and yet able to store large volumes of water without negatively impacting anyone nearby. In fact, this is what the ASR project looks like. They actually have it as an active running ranch. They've got these wells, they've got a water management facility that included a water treatment plant, which ultimately they didn't really need. But certainly from a number of different perspectives, including cost and environmental impacts, this is a really successful project. Now, the aquifer conditions and the water chemistry conditions need to be right for this to work, but it can be a really real success story. And this just shows on that San Antonio ASR system the amount of water that is in the aquifer and readily available to the city of San Antonio. And as of a couple of years ago, I guess, they had stored 150,000 acre feet of water in the aquifer. This is just the news clipping in the Ada News. Gosh, it's a few years ago now, 2019. Guy Sewell, who used to be a faculty member at ECU, is actually still working on this project to try to find ways to enhance the amount of water going into the Arbuckle-Simpson Aquifer through this recharge process. So let's talk about desalination real quick. So desalination is the process of removing salt from water that has salt in it, and it could be seawater, it could be brackish groundwater. There's lots of salty water around. In fact, 90% of the water on Earth is saline. It's in the oceans. There's only 3% in fresh water, and most of that is in ice caps and glaciers, with the remaining being in surface water and groundwater. So if we found a cheap way of removing salt from water, that would be awesome. That would solve a lot of problems, right? Of course, you'd have to transport it a long way to get it to Oklahoma from the Gulf of Mexico, but that's a different challenge. So when we talk about salt water in our oceans, it's somewhere between 15 and 50,000 parts per million. The Gulf of Mexico is about 34,000, something like that, parts per thousand, or parts per million. Brackish groundwater in estuaries or in groundwater in some places is in that range, 1,500 to 15,000. River water is typically in the 500 to 3,000 range. Most rivers that we know are in this 500 range. The Red River and Lake Texoma is closer to the 3,000 range, and that brings it outside of drinking water standards. And pure water is sort of less than 500. So there's a number of different ways to remove salt from water. Distillation is a process, same process as you use to distill whiskey, for example. You can use membranes. Those membranes have to be super small. The most conventional method is this reverse osmosis, which is effective. It's the most common, but it's also super energy intensive. You can get fresh water from salt water using a freezing process or electrodialysis. There's other methods available, but the membrane filtration, reverse osmosis, is the most common. And this is what it looks like across the world in terms of desalination. So we got a lot of desalination in the US, but the rest of it is primarily in the Middle East, places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Israel, places like that. There's a little bit of it in the UK, interestingly, for a country that gets so much rainfall, and quite a bit in Spain, where it's much drier. So this is what it looks like in the US. In the past, most of those desalination plants were along the coast in Florida and California and up in the East Coast. But more recently, they've moved inland, and you can see this, the blue line. Not surprisingly, it's cheaper to remove salt from brackish water than it is from seawater, right? Because there's less salt in it. And a lot of that brackish water is also groundwater, so you don't have to deal with organics and sediment and the things that you deal with when you're dealing with seawater. So actually, desalination of brackish groundwater is actually pretty cost effective in a lot of places. So I'm gonna skip this slide, but this well, let me talk about it super quickly. So this is what the ASR facility, back at the ASR facility in San Antonio. So what they can do, actually, this is a different area, but still San Antonio. What they're doing is pulling brackish water out of the Wilcox aquifer and desalinating that water, and injecting that bracket or desalinating the water, using it in the ASR well or just for regular water supply. But when you remove salt from water, you don't end up with table salt. You typically end up with a really salty brine that you have to dispose of. And you can dispose of that in a big sort of evaporation pond, or you can inject it back underground. And in their case, they're injecting it way down into the Georgetown Edwards. And that water, that aquifer, particularly part of the aquifer, has several confining zones that prevent it coming back up into the freshwater zone. So it's a good way to dispose of the water and not impacting anyone. But it's just a pretty expensive process to do that. So that's the main cost on brackish groundwater desalination is on those disposal costs. Okay, let's talk about reuse real quick. And I'm going to leave ourselves enough time for a discussion afterwards, Brandon, but I wanted to talk about reuse. I think I might have touched on this in one of my previous lectures, but there's lots of different ways that you can use wastewater or agricultural reuse. So wastewater reuse has been used in the ag industry for a long, long time, of course. If you treat it up to a standard whereby incidental contact with that water isn't detrimental to your health, you can use that treated wastewater pretty effectively for baseball fields and soccer fields and landscape irrigation. So that's been happening fairly regularly and for quite a long time now. And the same for industrial reuse as well. So if you've got a industrial process where you need a lot of water, but that water doesn't need to be super clean, you just need it for its cooling services, perhaps, or something like that. That wastewater is being reused in that way for a long time. You can also recharge aquifers with wastewater. So the city of El Paso has been doing this for a long time. They used to discharge their wastewater out into the desert with fairly minimal treatment and just let that waste evaporate gradually over time. But what they noticed after a while is that their aquifers were recharging. And so the process of that wastewater sort of slowly percolating through the ground actually cleaned up the water to a standard that it was suitable for drinking. And so they had a natural filter, natural treatment process out there in the desert. And so when they realized that was going on, they took more interest. And that's actually a process that's being actively managed right now, that groundwater recharge through wastewater disposal. Indirect potable reuse is where that water is discharged into the aquifer for the particular purpose of, sorry, let me back up a little bit, distracted there for a sec. So indirect potable reuse is where that wastewater is discharged into a river, say, or into a lake, and then pulled out at a different location. So you might discharge that wastewater into one part of the lake and let it do its thing, let it mingle with the other water, but then pull out that same volume of water from a different part of the lake. And sometimes you can get a permit to do that where you wouldn't be able to get a new permit for water out of the lake. So that's actually been going on for a long time as well, or a fairly long time as well. And then lastly, probably the most recent, the most difficult type of reuse is direct potable reuse, where the water basically goes straight from a wastewater treatment plant back into a water supply system. And I think I've got some slides that talk about that here. So indirect reuse, like I talked about, is where water is maybe pulled out of a lake, it's treated, it's used by the community, that wastewater is treated, it goes back into the river, and then some community downstream is pulling that water or some portion of that water back out, treating it, delivering it to the community, and that community uses that water, treats that wastewater and discharges it back into the river. And you can imagine for a bigger river like the Mississippi, that can happen hundreds and hundreds of times and has been happening for a long, long time. I lived in London for a couple of years, and there was an interesting statistic that I came across while I was there, where the intakes, by the time that water on the Thames River got to London, it had been reused, statistically being reused 14 times already. So every drop of water that you're using had actually been used 14 times by other people in the basin above it, above you. So it sounds a little bit unappealing, but it's something that's been going on for a long, long time. And if you've got good enough wastewater treatment standards in place, it doesn't sound quite as icky. There's a really interesting tour that I took a few years ago, and I think it's open to the public, whereby large municipalities are using wetlands to treat that wastewater. And this is a facility that's operated by North Texas Municipal Water District. So they treat that wastewater up to a certain standard, but to get a little bit of extra help and a little bit of extra treatment, they've constructed these wetlands. And the water, the wastewater in these wetlands is managed very carefully, but it then removes any additional organics, any additional nutrients and sediment and things like that that could potentially have a harmful impact on the river downstream. And this is, I forget how many acres this facility is, but it's certainly dozens of acres and maybe hundreds of acres that help with that treatment process. So if you're not drinking the water though, that's an easier sell, right? And the little community of Dripping Springs that I live in, a significant portion of our wastewater is now no longer being discharged or sprayed out onto a field just to get rid of it. It's actually being used for the soccer fields, the baseball fields, and actually is being used in the green areas in these high-end communities near where I live as well. But it can be used in irrigated agriculture. If that agriculture is going to be used for consumption, human consumption, then it has to meet a certain standard. But if it's just on a hay field or something like that, then that human or the standards need to be a lot lower. And it can also be used for livestock watering, but of course it needs to meet a certain standard there too. So I don't think I'm going to skip over this because I want to leave enough time at the end, but the nation's largest recycled water system is also in San Antonio. And they've got some 130 miles of what they call purple pipe. And purple pipe is a term that's used for wastewater. And it's actually, you may have seen these on trucks, but instead of white or blue pipelines to PVC pipelines to deliver water, these pipelines are purple, and that's to differentiate that water from potable water or from regular drinking water sources. And that water can be moved all over the place and used for particular purposes. So they've got three major recycling centers, and they're reusing about 29 million gallons a day of treated wastewater across the city for certain activities that they previously used water that was up at drinking water standards for. So if you look across the US, it's not being adopted particularly, at least the potable reuse hasn't been adopted particularly widespread across the Midwest, but everywhere else in the US, there's potable reuse. But even non-potable reuse, I mean, it's active in every state of the nation. So this is something that is happening. It's happening more and more, and it's becoming a solution to water management across the entire country. Okay, let me skip over this side, but it's just a schematic that shows on direct potable reuse. You're using the water from the source. It's being used by the community. It's being treated in a wastewater facility, and then typically it's running through a very advanced wastewater treatment. It's being stored thereafter, providing a buffer, and then it goes back to a regular drinking water treatment facility, and then is being supplied to the community. So there's no sort of outside environmental factor. It's not being discharged into a river or a lake and diluted there. It's going straight, this whole system is piped. It's a closed system, basically. That's what we mean by direct potable reuse. And there are some good examples in Texas. I don't think there's any examples in Oklahoma. In fact, Oklahoma's rules on that are just recently being developed or maybe are still being developed. But the Colorado River Municipal Water District in Texas had one of these. The city of Wichita Falls had one of these recently as well. So they are starting up. And reuse, if you look at demand management in the 2017 plan, demand management being supply or demand conservation, demand reduction, it's about 30%, but reuse is about 14%. So it's a pretty significant side of things. And like I said, those treatment standards need to be met in order for you to do this if that water is going to have even incidental contact with humans, and especially if it's going to be drunk. The tricky part with reuse, I think, has always been, and I think I shared this video in a previous presentation with Jack Black talking about Porcelain Springs water. I think that's a pretty amusing 10-minute video, but it's really the PR is the hard part, getting people to get their heads around the fact that the water that they're drinking was once the water that was flushing their toilet. But you know what? We have the engineers, we have the technology, we have the science, and we have the safety standards and regulations and protocols, whatnot, in place to make it perfectly safe. So we just kind of need to get our heads around that. Okay, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes at the end of this presentation talking about Fairfield Lake, and this is what I've been tied up on over the last week or so as an expert witness. Fairfield Lake is this itty-bitty lake near the bottom of the Trinity River. In this figure that you can see, the Dallas-Fort Worth area is shown in gray or dark gray. There's a lot of major water providers in this area, and the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in fact, this region that is shown by these counties, this whole region here, needs something like 1.3 million acre feet of water over the next 50 years to meet that future need. And that's a lot of water. And so the region is contemplating building new reservoirs, and that Lower Bodark Reservoir is one of them. But they're going to need to find a whole bunch more water over the next 50 years to meet that need. And one of the possibilities is Fairfield Lake. And Fairfield Lake was a lake used by a coal power plant, Illuminant/Texas Utilities power plant for like 50 years. And they leased part of the land to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to run as a state park. But when the coal plant was decommissioned, Texas Utilities wanted to sell it. TXU wanted to sell it, and they offered it to the park. The park said no, they'd really like it, but they don't want to pay the $100 million that Texas Utilities was asking for it. So Texas Utilities put it on the market. They canceled the lease with Texas Parks and Wildlife, which was $1 a year, by the way. Canceled the lease and put the property on the market. And a developer came in from the Dallas area and said, I'll buy the lake and the land around it, 5,000 acres in total, and I'll pay the $100 million you're asking, which he wanted to turn this property into a high-end development, with 3 golf courses and some high-end homes, the lots selling for somewhere in the $2 to $4 million range each, putting 600 lots on this property. So you can do the math on that. He thinks it's going to be a really lucrative development. But what's interesting with this lake, well, two things. One, the state of Texas stepped in and said, hey, we want to buy you out of that contract. We've changed our minds. We want to buy this property. The developer said, oh, hey, no way. I'm going to make a whole bunch of money out of this. And not only is the land worth a whole lot, but this water is worth a whole lot, which he was exactly right, partly because this lake is right on the end of this major pipeline bringing water from Richland Chambers Reservoir back up to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this lake is really only 10 miles from Richland Chambers Reservoir, so could in theory at least be used to top up the lake when it's needed. Tarrant Regional Water District is contemplating building this Lake Tawakona right here, and they're proposing to spend $500 million building that lake to get only a little bit more yield out of that lake than they're going to get out of Fairfield. So it's not too hard to imagine that they'd be willing to pay a good amount of money, probably in the range of $200 million just to get the water out of Fairfield Lake. So the state of Texas then condemned the property, and they said, all right, we're going to buy it. So too bad, but we'll give you fair market value for it. So there was a hearing on Monday and Tuesday where I was the expert witness, trying to place a value on the lake. And Texas Parks and Wildlife said, well, we only think it's worth $85 million and we want to run it as a state park. The developer said, well, I think it's worth $475 million, partly because of the value of water in the lake, but partly because of the development potential as well. It's a really pretty lake. It's a 2,500 acre lake with about another 2,500 acres of land around it. So it could be a really nice property. But anyway, the county commissioners ultimately sided more or less with the developer and said, yeah, we agree with you. We think it's worth about $418 million. So state officials, if you want to buy this, if you want to condemn this property, move forward with that and give them the fair market value, give the developer the fair market value, then you need to pay them $418 million. And which would be a pretty profit for the developer, right? Who only spent $100,000 or $100 million on it. But he doesn't want to sell, and he still thinks it's worth a heck of a lot more than that as a development property. So there'll be some further steps in the process on this, but it's a pretty interesting, story to help you understand the challenges and the opportunities related to water management in this part of the world. I'm gonna stop that story with a footnote, and that is the developer who has spent his adult life in the Dallas area and done many, many successful developments and many sort of billion-dollar developments. Went to Baylor University, but he went to Ada High School and grew up in the Ada area. So Sean Todd is the developer who actually, his dad built some buildings on the ECU campus, and his dad also built the Kerr Lab, apparently. But he went to college in Texas, went to Baylor, and started up a development company shortly after. And he's the one who's bought this piece of land and ultimately one day may build a pretty fancy development here. So stay tuned to that story. I think I sent you all the link to one of the many articles on Fairfield Lake. So take a look at that if you haven't already. It's a pretty interesting deal. I wanted to close with some comments on your research topics, your proposals. I am so sorry that I have not provided you any feedback on those yet. I had in my mind that these weren't due for another 3 or 4 weeks. And of course, they're due here really soon. So I'm going to provide you each and every one of you some feedback tonight. So go back and look at the Blackboard and get your feedback on that. But basically, for those that are listening right now, they all look good. No major changes of direction in any of them. Some of them are better than others, of course, but there's if I could provide some generalized feedback to everyone, there needs to be a literature review, of course. You need to research the subject and the specific issues. But what I'm looking for is on the research aspects of it. So what did you conclude? What did you learn? What are the possible solutions to this particular water issue? What are your thoughts? I'd like some input from you guys. And you're at the grad student level now, so you need to think independently, not just regurgitate what you're finding online or finding in resources. And that's what I'm particularly interested in that. After I wrap up this class or this lecture tonight, I'm going to run home, grab a bite to eat, but feel free to call me if you'd like to. I've read all of these research papers, so feel free to call me if you want some specific feedback, or you can email me. And like I said, later on tonight, you should have both a grade and some feedback on your proposals. So again, apologize for that, and look forward to seeing your final products. So with that, I'll let you go. Brandon, I know you're online. If you have any questions or comments, anything that I've presented today you'd like to discuss, and if not, I'll close it here and look forward to seeing you next time. Doesn't sound like Brandon has anything, so yeah, so Brandon is asking if it'd be possible to change the date, and I spoke with Dr. Pappas, who was the one who told me that it was due on Sunday, and I think we can push that date out a week or so. I'll try to confirm that with Dr. Pappas later this evening, and we'll put something in Blackboard, but you can probably all assume that you'll get an extra week to hand that in. But I'll confirm that and let everyone know as soon as possible. Good deal. Anything else, Brandon? I saw your notes. Thank you. Again, feel free to follow up with me by phone or email, and otherwise, we'll see you all next time. Thank you.